So hello everyone, my name is Navin Seeterram, Social Impact Director and Events Director at Cambridge University Social Impact and Sustainability Society, or as we call ourselves, CUSIS. And today I am pleased to be your humble host and moderator for this session. At CUSIS, we are dedicated to promoting the awareness and implementation of positive environmental, social, and governance practices into businesses, industry, government, and communities worldwide. We are delighted to welcome Alex Edmans, Professor of Finance at London Business School, who will be addressing the topic, how great companies deliver both purpose and profit. If I may ask you to bear with me to cover some housekeeping items, just to make sure that you have your mics off. And if you have any questions, please type them into the chat. And if you could do it after you've heard the entire talk, that would be great. So you can just hear out the argument. And then those questions will be addressed by Alex. The entire session is expected to take no more than an hour, finishing up at about 7 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. So, and if we could go on to, if you want, we could go on to Alex. And if Alex, you may continue on to speak. Thank you.
Okay, well, great. Well, thanks very much to Navin and Michael for the invitation. It's great to be here, and thank you to everybody for joining. So I know there's a lot going on around in the world at the moment, and thank you for giving up an hour to hear my thoughts on this topic. So what I'm going to speak on is how great companies deliver both purpose and profit. And I think a good place to start is to explain what I mean by a responsible business. Now, you might think, well, this is obvious, but actually I might have a slightly different view of responsibility to what you might have already heard. And I think a good place to start is to start with a story. So I'd like to take you, at least metaphorically, outside your home offices and on a journey around the world. So I'd like to take you to the Great Rift Valley. So this stretches across 2 continents and 6,000 kilometers from Lebanon and Asia to Mozambique in Africa. And it has some of the world's highest mountains, but also some of the world's deepest lakes. And one of these lakes is a lake called Lake Magadi, which is in the Kenyan stretch of the Great Rift Valley. So you might think, well, it's hard to imagine that you're here because you haven't seen it before, but you may have seen it before. Not on the small screen of your laptop, but on the big screen of a movie theatre. It was in the movie The Constant Gardener, based on the John le Carré novel. And indeed, millions of people around the world have seen this movie and therefore seen the lake. But fewer than 1,000 people call the lake their home. And one of these people is a gentleman called Emmanuel Saronga, and he makes a living selling and herding goats. So for Emmanuel, it used to be that cash was king. So it was cash that he'd get if he sold a goat, and then he'd have to check that cash in case it was forged. He'd have to store that cash and risk getting robbed. And then to bank that cash, it wasn't a question of going down to the high street. He had to walk for an entire day to get to the nearest bank. So his life was really tough. He couldn't graze his goats in the greenest pastures. He had to always be within one day of a bank. But all of this changed due to a responsible business. And that business was Vodafone. So in 2007, Vodafone launched M-Pesa, which is a mobile money service in Kenya. Let me explain briefly what mobile money is, because some people think it's mobile banking. Right? I have a nationwide bank account, and I can operate it on my phone rather than going to a branch. But that's actually not mobile money, right? Mobile money, you don't even need a bank account to begin with. And that was really powerful because 15 million Kenyans in 2007 did not have access to the banking system. So this transformed Emmanuel's life. He no longer needs to worry about cash. He doesn't need to worry about forgery or robbery, and he can graze his goats where he wants to. He doesn't need to be within one day of a bank. And also his accounting was easy, right? He had a record of every transaction on his phone, so he had no problem with record keeping. And we don't want to make a big deal out of just one person, but more generally, a study found that within the first 7 years of the launch of M-Pesa, 200,000 households got lifted out of poverty. And most of these households were headed by women. It allowed them to move from agriculture to business and retail, so it had a big effect on gender parity. So that's one story I'm giving you about Vodafone. But let me now give you another story, and that story surrounds tax. So in 2012, Vodafone became the first telecoms company around the world to release a tax transparency report showing how much tax they are paying to governments worldwide. And that's very important in the telecoms industry. Why? Because you could choose to locate your licenses in low tax countries. So I've got two questions for everybody here to think about. So the first is, which of these decisions created most value for society? And the second is, which of these decisions would have created the most public outrage if you didn't take that decision? So I think most people here would answer the same way, so I'm not going to poll anybody. So which decision created most value for society? It was the first one. By launching M-Pesa, Vodafone lifted 200,000 households out of poverty. But what would have been the backlash if Vodafone had not launched M-Pesa? It would have been nothing, right? So you don't get in trouble for not creating an innovation. Why? Right, the media would have never known it was ever possible to do something crazy like banking without a bank, and therefore they would have never slammed you had you not done this. But what is the media backlash if you're not transparent on tax? Right, it could be massive. And indeed, Vodafone themselves had suffered a nationwide boycott of their stores in 2010. So, what am I telling you? Why am I asking you these questions? Well, we often think about responsible business as being the answer to the second question. Right, a responsible business should do no harm. It should not cheat on tax. It should not pollute the environment. It should not price gouge customers. And absolutely, don't get me wrong, right? A responsible business must absolutely not do those things. But you already knew that before you came on this webinar. You didn't need to give up your hour to hear me to tell you that responsible businesses should not destroy value. Instead, what I want to do is to shift our thinking about responsibility and think about it as being much more the answer to the first question. Right? It's about actively doing good, actively creating social value, doing some crazy things like banking without a bank. Because I would say that right now in 2020, with the magnitude of the world's problems, it is not enough to simply do no harm and not destroy value. A company needs to actively do good with the resources and expertise that it has at its disposal. And so this is something which I introduced in a recent book, this framework here. So we can think about the value that a company creates as being given by a pie. And that pie can be given either to investors in the form of profits, or to society or stakeholders in the form of wages to workers or taxes to the government, or low prices to customers. And we often think that responsibility is about splitting the pie fairly, right? We don't want to pay the minimum tax we can get away with. We don't want to make sure that we don't want to mistreat our workers. We want to pay them more than the minimum wage. And again, absolutely, fairness is important. But again, you knew that before coming on this webinar. So instead, what I want to highlight is actually thinking about responsibility as being about fairness is limited for at least two reasons. The first is it's bad for businesses, right? So if responsibility means that the company is going to become less profitable, many executives won't want to put it into practice, right? We saw last year 181 CEOs sign the Business Roundtable statement, but many of them actually not translating it into action. And why would they, right? If it means the business is less profitable, let's do it to the minimum extent. Now, the second reason why we don't want to just split the pie differently is it's bad for investors. Now, many politicians might say, I don't care, right? They like to portray investors as nameless, faceless capitalists. Investors are them, society is us, and if we can take from them and give to us, then that's going to be electorally popular. But hopefully I don't need to tell this audience about social impact that investors are not just them, they are us, right? They include parents saving for their children's education, pension funds investing for their retirees, or insurance companies laying to set aside future claims. So any repurposing of business absolutely needs to take investors seriously. So this is why what I view a responsible business as being is that it's about growing the pie. So we absolutely do want to increase the orange, but we do that not by giving them a greater share of what's already there, not by splitting the pie differently through donating to charity, but by being relentlessly committed to innovation and excellence, doing some crazy things like launching M-Pesa, like banking without bank, and then as a byproduct, investors will become better off and make more profit. And so what I call this in the book is pie economics. Now, you could love or you could hate that phrase, but regardless of the term, let me go through the definition. It seeks to create profits only through creating value for society. So let me pick apart this definition. Right, the final 4 words, creating value for society, that shouldn't be surprising, right? You knew this before you came on this webinar. But the first 4 words, creates profits through, highlights that we must do this in a profitable way, right? Profits are really important, but the important word here is also only. So what we see is that solving social problems is the end goal, and then profits are a byproduct of doing this. If profits were the end goal, that would lead us to mistreating workers or price gouging customers and not creating value. Now, at this point in the talk, you might think, well, everything I've said so far, that sounds great, but where is the evidence? It sounds a bit like wishful thinking. It sounds too good to be true. Right, it would be fantastic if companies that created value for society suddenly magically became more profitable, but isn't that a bit like wishful thinking? Well, this is why most of my job as a professor is to look at rigorous evidence to see, is this actually true? And it's important that the evidence be rigorous because of this concern of confirmation bias, which is that people would like to accept evidence uncritically if it confirms what people would like to be true. So let's say if I were a climate change denier, I'm not, but hypothetically, if I was, and if I saw some studies saying climate change is a hoax, I would accept that uncritically without actually studying it. And similarly with a responsible business, we would like to live in a world in which responsible companies perform better. And so if a study claims that they do, then we might accept it uncritically. And so this is something I explored in a TED talk called What to Trust in a Post-Truth World, about the dangers of believing what we would like to be true. So I don't want to spend more time on this today, but instead think about this in the context of the question at hand, which is social impact and sustainability. So here I'm taking a newspaper article from Forbes, which says that companies that excel in sustainability outperform their peers. Nothing wrong with that, right? The journalist is just reporting on what a study claims. But here's the problem. That is the premise of a new report, and it is an accurate one, judging by many conversations with those interested in governance and sustainability. So how does the journalist judge whether this is actually going a correct report? Not by looking at the methodological rigor, but just by asking people who already believe in sustainability, right, do you think this report is correct? And obviously they would say yes, but that's because they want it to be true. So what I want to do today is be much more rigorous than this and ask, is the evidence actually there that purposeful companies actually perform better, or are they just fluffy companies distracted from the bottom line? So to do this, I needed a measure of how well a company treats society. Now, this is difficult because I can't just look at the mission statement, because you could say some great things, but never actually put it into practice. So what I chose to do is to look at how well a company treats its workers. So why do I do that? Workers are not the only aspect of society, right? There's the environment and there's customers, but I chose workers because I had a very good measure available, which is the list of the 100 best companies to work for in America. And this list is really powerful for a couple of reasons. I think the main one here that I'm going to focus on is that it was available from 1984. So I have tons of data. So because responsible business is a pretty new phenomenon, most of the data sources have only been around for the last 10 years. And if I showed that responsibility paid off between 2010 and 2019, you might be skeptical because you might think, well, those 10 years were a really boom time for the economy. Maybe responsibility only pays off in a boom, and maybe only right now, right in a pandemic, we don't care about this. We need to focus on survival. But because my data started in 1984, I could go through things such as the financial crisis, such as September 11th, such as the collapse of the internet bubble, to make sure that this paid off in bad times as well as good. And also, as we know, correlation doesn't imply causation, so I have to do further tests to show, is it employee satisfaction that causes better financial performance? Or is it that only once a company is doing well, can it treat its employees well? And well, there's a lot of methodology in the paper to really nail the result, but I'm not going to bore you with all of those details. I want to get to the bottom line and then talk about the implications for all of you and then the next steps and call to action. So what I find is that the 100 best companies to work for in America delivered stock returns that beat their peers by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period, which is 89 to 184% cumulative. So this is serious stuff. So what it suggests is that companies that treat their workers well are not just being fluffy and worthy, they're being commercially successful and focusing on long-term profit. So often when I speak at conferences about the importance of responsibility and purpose, people introduce me as a professor of finance, and the audience does a double take. The audience is a bit confused because finance is often the enemy of social impact and sustainability. But what the research shows is actually, well, this is something that a CFO or CEO should take really seriously because this is something that is linked to long-term performance. So this is just business sense in order to be responsible. I'm going to skip the next section just because we started a little late. I want to make sure there's enough time for questions and keep to our promise of not going beyond an hour. Instead, I want to get into how do we put this into practice? And I want to get to like the elephant in the room, which is if indeed we want to run a business where shareholder value is the end goal, we know how to do that. Like we know how to evaluate investments. We look at net present value. Right? Finance professors and textbooks have taught that for the last 50 years. But if instead we want to run the business with social impact being one of the goals, right, how do we make a decision, right? If we can't just look at net present value, we need something else to look at. And notice there are some people who say, well, companies should just take any investment that creates value for society. But that's clearly unrealistic because if you do that, you're not going to be meeting the needs of your investors. So what I do in chapter 3 of the book is I talk through a number of principles to guide a leader through these difficult decisions of what investments to take and what investments to turn down. And again, I can't go through all of them because of time, but let me just go through the third one, which is the principle of materiality. And to do that, before I define materiality, I'd like to define the word purpose because it's been a subtext to my talk, but I haven't formally defined it. Now, often people think that the word purposeful is a synonym for altruistic. So a purposeful company is one that serves wider society. You might have a purpose statement like the first red bullet. It's to serve customers, workers, suppliers, the environment, and communities and investors. Now, that sounds great, but that's not what actually the word purposeful means. So we think about it etymologically, purposeful means focused and targeted, right? If I was to have a purposeful meeting, it's one with a clear agenda. If I do something on purpose, I do it deliberately. So a purposeful company is one that knows exactly how it is going to serve society. So purpose, if you look at the third bullet point, it's why an enterprise exists, it's who it serves, its reason for being, and the role that it plays in the world. So the answer to that must be focused and targeted, just like a person's purpose would never be to be a doctor and a lawyer and a teacher and an entrepreneur. You might choose to be one of those. And so let's just go to an example of where this matters. So let's think about Engie, the French energy company. So they thought, do we shut down Hazelwood, which is the most polluting plant in the OECD? Now, if we do that, right, it's good for the environment, but it's bad for workers. So if our purpose statement is to serve workers and the environment, that's not going to help us evaluate that trade-off. But if instead our purpose is focus and it says, well, which of the stakeholders is most material, which stakeholder is most important for our core business, then it's going to guide us. So this is what I mean by materiality. Yes, we'd like to serve absolutely everybody, but that's just not realistic, because we will face trade-offs such as the closure of a polluting plant. So what materiality says is which of these stakeholders is the most critical and therefore the one we're going to focus on most. And so this takes me to the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board materiality map. So what this does is it goes industry by industry and highlights, well, what are the stakeholders that are most material to that industry? So if we take the first column, which is extractives and minerals processing, well, there the environment matters a lot, right? So because your impact on it is very high, if you're not reducing it, you might fall foul of regulation. Now, what about for banks? Now, this is interesting because this suggests that at least your direct effect on the environment is not that high if you're a bank. But what matters much more is social capital, right? So selling practices and product labeling. We don't want to be in a Wells Fargo fake bank account scandal. Customer privacy, data security, that is important as well. So what that means is that even though climate change is the order of the day, and it's something I care passionately about, maybe if you're a bank, even more valuable than perhaps telling your executives not to take business flights is to say, well, let's really nail our customer privacy and data security. And that is linked to the final study that I'm going to discuss with you, which is on the value of materiality. So what they do is they take the ESG, Environmental, Social and Governance data set from MSCI, perhaps the best known data set, and it finds that firms that do well on every issue, they don't actually beat the market. They only beat the market by 1.5% per year, and that's insignificant. And if instead, right, they did this again, and they did well on the material issues, but scaled back on the immaterial ones, they did beat the market by 4.8%. So it's worth here pausing to highlight the significance of this result, right? Because what it suggests is that it's better for a company to do well on only a few things than for it to do well on everything. Because maybe if you're doing well on everything, the one thing that you're forgetting about is your shareholders. Okay, so this takes me to the final section, which is how do we apply this to the crisis and how do we apply this to our own lives and in terms of a call to action? So in the pandemic, we have seen some companies respond in some fantastic ways to the crisis. So they've done what I would call pie splitting actions. They've split the pie differently. They are accepting smaller slices of the pie to make sure there's more to go around for everybody else. So there's some CEOs who are being paid nothing. There's some companies who are continuing to pay their workers, even if they're furloughed. And there's some companies who are helping out their customers. So Unilever is giving 100 million euros of food and sanitizer to local communities. Now, those are fantastic examples, right? And any company that does this should be widely praised. However, the problem with viewing responsibility as splitting the pie fairly is that not everybody can split the pie, right? So what if you are not in the food and sanitizer industry, you don't have relevant products to give? Or what if you just don't have 100 million euros lying around, right? You can't spend money. So that is why, to come full circle, I started my talk with the importance of viewing responsibility as being about growing the pie, actively creating value through being relentlessly committed to innovation and excellence using your expertise. So what this means is that a responsible leader can ask herself, what is in your hand? So what are the resources and expertise that my company has, and how can I think creatively about how to use them to serve wider society? And the power of this is it means that companies can help out even if they are in completely unrelated industries. So let's take Chelsea Football Club, right? Football doesn't clearly help you out in a pandemic, but what is in Chelsea Football Club's hand is a hotel, and it's allowing doctors and nurses to stay at that hotel after a day of fighting on the front line of a hospital. Or separately, let's take LVMH, right? So they make perfume. That's not really useful in a pandemic, but what is in their hand is a factory that uses alcohol, and that alcohol can be used for sanitizer, and they're using that to help out with another idea. So just as Vodafone uses expertise in technology to solve this very different problem of financial inclusion in Kenya, LVMH can help out by repivoting from perfumes to sanitizer. And one great example is Mercedes. So Mercedes, they normally make turbo engines and pistons for Formula One, but more generally, they have a precision engineering expertise. And the same precision that you need to make a Formula One piston, you need to manufacture a continuous positive air pathway breathing machine, because those breathing machines, which are a less invasive alternative to ventilators, they must be absolutely spot on if they are going to help a patient recover from coronavirus. And indeed, they're using their engineering expertise in something completely different. What about if they're a large company hit by a crisis? So let's say you're Qantas Airways, which is in Australia, and you've got some furloughed employees, right? You would like to keep paying them, but you can't. You just don't have money because nobody's flying your planes. But what is in your hand is a relationship. And that relationship is with Woolworths. So don't think about Woolworths in the UK, right? Think about Woolworths in Australia as a grocery store. So the relationship used to be that if you bought groceries from Woolworths, you could get air miles from Qantas. Now, they've leveraged that relationship so that now, if you're a furloughed employee from Qantas, you can now work for Woolworths. And finally, well, what about a small company? Right, so let me talk about a small company that I'm a customer of. I went to them this morning. It's called Barry's Boot Camp. It's a brutal gym in London. It has people like David Beckham going to it. And so they were closed for 4 months during the pandemic, from March to July, and they're obviously going to be closed again from Thursday. But what is in their hand is the ability to run fitness classes as fitness expertise. And so what they did was launched free online fitness classes through Instagram, which really meant a lot because people were self-isolating at home. Now you might think, well, that's not that innovative for a fitness company to offer fitness classes. But here's the great thing, right? So what if you are a desk worker at that gym and the gym is closed? What can you do? Well, it turns out that some of these desk workers were actors as their main job. And if you're an actor, your income is pretty volatile. So you took this desk job to provide income stability. And if you are an actor, what is in your hand? You're really funny. Well, how does that help out in a pandemic? Well, what we had was a lot of parents where their children were at home because the schools were shut. And so they offered programs such as Zoom storytelling sessions, which took the load off their working parents. So that might be a small thing, but those things make a big difference. And I think if there is to be a small silver lining in the pandemic, It is about how we can think differently about responsibility. It isn't just throwing money at a problem, because if it was, then small companies could not be responsible because they don't have money. Then large companies could not be responsible in an economic downturn. But if responsibility is about redeploying our skills and knowledge to solve social problems, that involves a mindset shift for often not a huge financial cost, then I think this could have a huge impact. And this takes me to my final point on the part that we can all play as citizens. Because when we think that responsibility is no longer about spending money, this is powerful, because in some companies, we are not the CEO. Right? You might think the CEO or the CFO can choose who to donate to charity, but what if you're an associate or an analyst in an investment bank? How can you change things? Well, what we've seen in the pandemic is we've seen a few actions by some citizens that have shaped culture. So people know about how Captain Sir Tom Moore managed to not just raise £30 million himself by walking around his garden, but inspired a nation and led other people to themselves do some fundraising. So what we saw there, I don't think it was that everybody used to be selfish and now are selfless. I think everybody used to be selfless, but the actions of a few people ignited the innate selflessness within them. And so this is, I think, the real power that we can play as individuals and citizens, no matter how senior or junior we are in an organization, is to create a tipping point and to be the thermostat, not the thermometer. Right? A thermometer reflects the temperature around you, a thermostat affects it. Now, you might think, well, that sounds really lofty. Well, so let me give you an example. So let me give you an example from my own short career in industry. So before becoming a professor, I had a proper job. I used to work for Morgan Stanley, as you can see here, from my fleece. And when I joined Morgan Stanley, I was right at the bottom. So I was an analyst, which is right at the bottom of the food chain. And if you're an analyst, nobody works for you. The associate, you're working for him, and he's working for the vice president, and she's working for the executive director. But actually, people did work for me. Like, there was my secretary, there was the IT department, there was the print room, and there was perhaps the most abused department in an investment bank, which is the graphics department. So what you do is you give them a PowerPoint markup, and then they will implement it. And often the analysts would shout at the graphics department for not doing what they wanted, even though it was often their fault for not actually telling them. And so there were some times where I would actually get a good work back, and I would call them up and I'd say, "Hi, this is Alex. Somebody did a job for me. Who was it?" They would say, "It's Juliet." And I would say, "Oh, can you put me through to Juliet?" And they did. And I said, "Well, hi, Juliet. This is Alex. Your job was fantastic. You did all of these things really well. And I didn't even ask you to do this, and you did this anyway." And I didn't do this sort of to try to be saintly in front of everybody, but it just so happened because I was so junior, I didn't have my own office. I sat in what was called the bullpen in the middle of the room, and other analysts heard, and then they thought, well, we can have these conversations ourselves. And they started to do the same themselves. And I'm obviously not going to claim I changed the entire atmosphere of Morgan Stanley, but this shows how small things can make a big difference, is that you may be completely junior, but we have the ability to give positive feedback. Or one of my friends during pandemic, he's a lawyer. What is in his hand is he is financially secure. So what he was able to do was to go to his local coffee shop and say, "I'm going to advance purchase 100 coffees from you," which is giving them £300. That was a vital lifeline of liquidity to help them to get through the pandemic. And so what I want to end now is with a call to action. And so for people to think about in their own time, for those of you in a leadership position within your company, what is in your company's hand? What are the skills and resources that you could redeploy to solve social problems? So what for you is your M-Pesa for Vodafone, a telecoms company, which at the time was focused on just winning spectrum license auctions in the West? And then similarly for you personally, what is in your own hand, right? So what expertise or do we have or to help out? Is it the ability to call somebody in the isolation period that we're going to have in terms of the lockdown? Is it the ability to do grocery shopping for neighbours? Is it the ability to make advanced purchases to help out local businesses? But I hope this will be something which is not just food for thought, but also could be a plan of action. And then for those of you interested in reading further about this, as I mentioned, I wrote this up in a recent book. And why I just chose to write the book was that for far too long, I think that people have viewed responsibility as being fluffy and worthy and nice to have, but not really commercial. And I wanted to write about this as a hard-hearted, emotionalist finance professor and say, well, even from a finance standpoint, this is something we should take really seriously. And this is not based on wishful thinking, but a lot of rigorous evidence. Now, unfortunately, sometimes this evidence is written in academic journals and inaccessible to any normal person. So I wanted to write this up in simple language with some case studies and some frameworks to put into practice. So I hope that this might be something of value to anybody who's interested in responsible business. Okay, so thank you so much to everybody for their attention. So I'm going to hand back over to either Navin or to Michael. So either of you, feel free to man the Q&A.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that. That was a fantastic presentation. There's one question that's in there by Mr. Owen Thompson. Do investors in being responsible see a trade-off from environmental and climate goals versus social or societal goals, and how can investors or firms assess this?
Thank you, Owen. So I think that there is a trade-off because on the one hand, I've said there's many things where there isn't a trade-off. So if you treat your workers well and you pay them more, that costs money, but in the long run, there isn't a trade-off. But there are certain things where in the long run, there is still a trade-off. So if you went back to the materiality map, right, there are certain stakeholders which are not material for certain industries in terms of their business. So for example, in banks and insurance, if they were to reduce their carbon footprint, which they certainly have an indirect effect on because who they choose to lend to, that might not clearly improve their profits. At least the evidence doesn't suggest that. So there is a trade-off there. However, it may well be that certain investors think that, well, even if there is no benefit in terms of shareholder returns, we are willing to make that sacrifice because as investors, we don't just want our company to make long-term profits, we want our companies to contribute towards reducing their carbon footprint. And so, well, how does a company make the trade-off? What I think is that companies need to run and have buy-in with their investors. So one thing that I've just written for the Wall Street Journal, so they've accepted it, but it might not come out for sort of a week or so because they need to copy edit it, is this idea of a say on purpose. So what do I mean by this? Right now, we currently have a say on pay, where any pay policy needs to be vetted by investors. What a say on purpose would be something similar, but on the purpose of a company. So it might be a company needs to say, well, we are actually going to sacrifice financial returns and profits in order to decarbonize. And do you as investors buy into that? And many times investors will. And so a vote on that would be really powerful because that would give legitimacy to shareholders to pursue not just long-term shareholder value, but also these additional goals. So there are indeed trade-offs in the long run, and I think we need to not sweep them under the carpet. So while, yes, I do believe many things do grow the pie and benefit both, there are certain things, as Owen points out, where reducing carbon footprint will be costly, I think, even in the long term, but it may well be that investors are willing to do this. But I think rather than a company just pursuing this and not consulting the investors first, which might lead to the stock price dropping and so forth, I think it's important to get investors buy-in. And in many cases, investors will buy in. So just like Unilever with their sustainable living plan, they were supporting it. And that's why when Kraft made an attractive takeover bid, investors weren't interested.
All right, fantastic. Thank you. Our next question comes from, I hope I'm pronouncing this properly, Ilko Fiole. And she asks, how does Pionomics relate to the legal definition of fiduciary duty versus investors? Do we need a slightly changed definition?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. So there is this common viewpoint, which is that, we need to change fiduciary duty. Section 172 of the Companies Act is not conducive to responsible business. But that's actually not the case. And actually, a lot of people who make that argument are not lawyers. They don't have legal expertise. But if they were to say, oh, I want to change the law to support responsible business, a lot of people will say, oh, this is a radical reformer. Let's get behind him or her. So a lot of people have tried to get publicity for themselves by saying, let's rip up the law. So I've spoken to a lot of senior corporate lawyers who have much more experience than me. And they actually say, look at the legal definition of fiduciary duty. There is nothing in Section 172 of the Companies Act which says that companies cannot take wider society into account. They say that the duty of directors is to promote the success of the company, and that involves taking stakeholders really seriously. And indeed, there was a law commission, a law society review a few years ago looking at pension funds duties. So as a pension fund trustee, are you allowed to consider these other aspects such as climate change, as Owen was mentioning? And the answer is yes. So actually, the imposition, so there's some CEOs who think, oh, I'm not going to bother thinking about responsibility until they change the law. To be honest, I think that's a cop-out, right? That's just an excuse not to take it seriously. You cannot indeed do it within the confines of the law, as lawyers, senior lawyers tell me. Your final question is, do I have a discount code for poor students interested to buy your book? I don't even have one for myself, I'm afraid. However, what I made sure is that they priced it at a low-priced trade book, not as a high price hard copy. So I get virtually no royalties from this. It's actually Cambridge University Press, which is obviously linked to your society. So why I wanted to write this is to make it accessible for a general audience. So actually at Amazon right now, it's at a 30% discount. It's £13. Actually, Kindle is even cheaper. It's a 45% discount. That's £10. And so forth. So hopefully you can get this basically for a tenner in terms of the Kindle version.
All right, thank you. So this question comes from, well, from me, Alex.
Okay,
so you discuss enlightened shareholder value, ESV, in your book. Do you think ESV is a stepping stone for businesses to adopt a pienomics mentality, or should ESV be disregarded completely in favor of a direct to pie economics approach?
Thanks very much. This is an important question. And so let me explain what I mean by ESV. So enlightened shareholder value. Now, there are people who argue, well, shareholder value, that is completely the opposite of responsible business, because shareholder value means being really short-termist. But actually, we think about it, right? Shareholder value is an inherently long-term concept, right? It includes all the future profits of a company. And that's not just theoretical, right? In reality, some of the most valuable companies right now, like Tesla, their value is much higher than their current earnings. So what enlightened shareholder value says is that it's fine for a company to focus on maximizing shareholder value, because as long as it's long-term shareholder value, right, then we will forced to be helping customers and workers, right? Because we know that if we want to maximize long-term shareholder value, a company needs to treat society really, really well. But the problem with that is that if you are to think about, do I invest in my workers? You do this with a calculation. I think about, do I give more maternity leave to my workers? Well, if I do that, yeah, I've got some sense they're going to be more productive and they're going to make more money for me later, but there's no way that I could do that calculation. So what responsible business or pienomics says is, let me give more maternity or paternity leave to my employees just because it's the right thing to do. I'm going to do it because I care about my workers without a calculation. And what I'm saying is that will actually lead you to investing more in your workers and actually making more money than an approach purely based on shareholder value maximization. So that's why I say it would be quite different to enlighten shareholder value, because we're doing things for intrinsic reasons rather than for instrumental. And therefore, I would say perhaps no to your question, Navin, as I'm not sure that enlightened shareholder value should be a stepping stone, because that is all about doing something because we're going to make money for it. And I think a purposeful company is doing something because we think it's addressing a social problem, but then we're recognizing that if we do that successfully, then ultimately we'll become profitable.
All right, thank you for that. There is another question. Hey, oh, thank you, Ilko. There's another question, I think, from Xavier Parkhouse. I'm not
There might be.
seeing.
I can immediately see a question from Bethany Davis. So can
Right.
I can
Yeah,
answer
please.
Bethany's question just
Yep,
while
yep,
you find
please.
out? So what she has is, what do we have a narrow view of shareholder value? Can expanding how we view value to the environment mean that there'll be a better case for prioritizing environmental practice? A really great question. So the couple of things I'll say here. So first is that actually shareholder value is a much broader concept than one might think. So often think that people think shareholder value is short-term profit, but actually shareholder value contains lots of long-term things, including how we treat the environment and how we treat workers. Because if a company mistreats its workers, in the long term, shareholder value goes down because it's not going to have a great workforce. And similarly, if a company keeps polluting the environment, then indeed shareholder value will go down. Also, because it's going to have a very bad environmental record and reputation. So what I'm actually putting in the chat is a article I wrote about Milton Friedman, saying that actually shareholder value is much broader than one might think. So people who say, well, let me just rant on shareholder value and say shareholder value is completely evil. Again, they're people who make these radical positions in order to become famous, but actually there is much more about shareholder value which is consistent with the responsible business than what we might think. But I still would agree with Bethany that there's this important distinction. So shareholder value, long-term profits, that does take into account a lot of responsibility factors. However, I would distinguish between shareholder value and shareholder welfare. So what is the distinction? Right, I'm a shareholder in companies. I might retire in 40 years' time, and I care about the value of my pension. Right, that is shareholder value. But actually, I care about my welfare. I care about the life that I'm going to be living in 40 years' time. And I don't want to retire in a world in which the climate is 2 degrees higher and in which there's social and income inequality and a lack of diversity. So what that means is my own welfare is affected by a lot of these other things, which is why I would be perfectly happy for the companies that I invest in to sacrifice even long-term profits in order to address these societal challenges. So what that means, Bethany, is that actually, yes, then shareholder value is narrow, but what I think we should care about is shareholder welfare. And what is important about this is it suggests that shareholder primacy is not an evil thing as people claim, right? Shareholder primacy means that a business is run in the interest of shareholders, but most of these shareholders are you or me, or they are pension funds, or they are mutual funds which pension funds invest in. And a lot of us as shareholders, we do want to reduce carbon footprint. We do want to promote diversity. We do want to promote equality. And this is why a lot of investors are, not everybody, but many serious investors are trying to push companies to be more material. And that's why I don't see this huge mismatch between shareholder engagement and long-term value maximization for society.
All right. Okay. So here's a question from Xavier. What about the problem of impact? He's read a lot about how ESG is ambiguous with companies like Shell classes ESG as being best in class and so on.
Yeah, so what is the problem of impact? So ESG factors, what they typically look at is, I would say, do no harm. So they will look at how much harm does the company create in terms of contributing to water usage or carbon emissions and so on. Whereas impact, I see more as actively doing good, the positive value that we are creating. And so this is why I led with the idea of Vodafone to say that impact is much more than ESG. And to give a recent example, I serve on the Responsible Investment Advisory Committee of Royal London Asset Management, and we run 5 sustainable funds. And one thing which has become really important recently is the warming potential of your portfolio. So you might have seen recently that MSCI has come up with this warming tool to calculate the warming potential of your portfolio. Now, when we ran this on our own portfolio, the worst offenders were semiconductor companies. Why? Because the production of semiconductors does involve some carbon footprint. But on the flip side, with semiconductors, they will power the solutions to global warming, and semiconductors have some other great usages, right, with computers and mobile devices to allow people in developing countries to access data and to be connected. So this highlights, I think, again, the importance of not having just binary thinking, looking at how much bad a company does, but also how much good it creates. And so how do we look at things such as sort of problematic industries such as energy? Well, at Royal London, and this is our approach, this is not to say it's the right approach, but we will say, actually, even in a problematic industry, we might still hold your shares if you are what is called best in class. We indeed use your phrase here. So is it bad to invest in a fossil fuel company? Well, if we think that we are able to move you towards transition and you've got a clear transition plan, then we might actually think that we create more value by holding shares in you and working with you to make sure that you're held accountable to your transition plan than to hold a company which is in a completely non-controversial industry, right? As a doctor, you don't want to go to healthy people, you go to sick people. And therefore, I do think if a company is actually making positive impact, but has a clear way of trying to reduce its harm, then I don't think it's a problem to be investing in that company. And so semiconductors might be one of them. Okay, so Diana has a question here, and so Tian here. Yes. So let's go to the next. So Diana says, if a company has extra cash, do you believe it should return it to investors who can then make donations, or should the company make direct investments or donations as a single giant player? Okay, this is a great question. One, I have a view, but my view might not be the correct one, but let me at least float my view to you. So I believe that companies should not give money to charity. Why? So let's say Navin and I are both investors in Vodafone. I care about cancer research and Navin cares about animal rights. So if Vodafone was to donate money to cancer research, well, that would be good for me, but it wouldn't be good for Navin. And more generally, what is Vodafone's expertise? Its expertise is in using telecoms. It's not deciding what of the cancer charities is the best charity, right? If they want to give to cancer research, should this be Cancer Research UK, Macmillan Cancer Relief, leukemia and lymphoma, and so on? It's not clear. So that's not Vodafone's expertise. Whereas if they were instead to return this to investors, Navin and me, in the form of donations, right, in the form of dividends, sorry, we can choose to support what we would like to support. And maybe for us, it's not a charity. Maybe Navin wants to send his children to college, and that is actually an important way of contributing towards society. So I actually don't believe that companies should give to charity. Now, I recognize the point that Diana makes, which is an important one, is that, well, if a company gives to charity, it has one large impact. However, I think lots of people individually giving to charities, that gets spread out and can have a lot of impact itself. And also the real power often of individuals giving to charity is they often then have a commitment, an emotional tie to that charity, not just the money that they give. For example, for me, I care a lot about giving money to cancer charities, but also when I lived in America, I was head running coach for the American Cancer Society, so that anybody who was running the Philadelphia Marathon or half marathon for us, I would coach them. So that would mean that the donation led to me having an emotional tie with that charity, and therefore that created a much stronger bond than the money that I was giving. Okay. Then Chan asks, what would be the causal factors to allow purposeful companies to outperform their peers? Is it because customers recognize the value of the mission? Yeah, so it's a couple of things, Chan. So first is indeed customers. So there are studies showing how much customers are more willing to pay for responsible companies. And we can think of, say, organic food versus traditional food or locally sourced produce as being some examples, but also it's really for employees, right? So what studies have looked at is employees becoming more productive and more motivated. In the past, you didn't care about employee motivation because they had a contract, right? And that contract said, every widget that you produce on a factory, we will pay you $1 per widget. So you motivated them with money. But nowadays, what we seek from an employee is not just something like producing a widget, but innovation, expertise, mentoring others. And if you really care about the company, their mission, they will be wanting to do all of those other things. So I think it's the motivation aspect. Just like for me, I don't get paid to do webinars after hours, but I'm loving doing this. I really like talking to you because this is something I really care about. And I think there was just one other question, which Navin says we have time for, which is from Nazif. So there's two questions here. So let me go to the second one. So since shareholder primacy and executive compensation seem to be intricately linked, shouldn't primacy structures be changed so that executive compensation does not remain unbridled? I would answer actually no on this. So I understand the thing behind your question, but executive pay is actually something I've done a lot of research here. So people say, oh, executive pay, that's too bad. It's bad because it's tied too much to the stock price. And that means that that executives don't care about wider society. But that's not based on evidence. So what we wanted to do is actually look at the evidence. And there's an entire chapter in the book, chapter 5, which looks at the evidence and what happens when CEOs are tied to the stock price, as long as it's the long-term stock price. And what was found was that they improve not just long-term profitability, but they also treat their employees better, treat the environment better, and treat communities better. Because if I am a CEO and my shares are going to be locked up for 7 years, I need to make sure that my company sustainable is going to be around and flourishing in 7 years' time. I need to make sure that my workers are flourishing, that I have a great environmental record, and are producing products and services that transform customers' lives for the better. Now, I know there are a lot of further questions, but let me honor the commitment to end on time and just say, if you've got further questions and we didn't have time for them here, if you drop me a note on LinkedIn, I will promise to get back to anybody on your questions. I really appreciate such engagement. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but let me hand back to Michael and Navin for the close.
All right, thank you very much for that. We would like to, if we could pass it on to our president, Mr. Michael Williams, to do a closing remarks and vote of thanks.
Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yes.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right, great. No, we had a few hiccups at the start, so I appreciate you bearing with us, Alex. I just want to wrap it up by saying thank you so much, Professor, for joining us today and for your key insights here. And I've read your book, and it's fantastic. I highly recommend everybody get out and buy it, read it, borrow it, whatever you need to do, because it does make some very great points. One of the things that Alex and I chatted about leading up to this webinar today was, what steps can we take as students and as business leaders and as future business leaders to affect positive change today? Not just close our laps and say, wow, that was really pleasant and informative, and then go about our business. But what can we do? And I think that's one thing that his book does address. So many ESG advocates out there say, scream at the top of their lungs, things have to change, and then that's it. They don't offer any solutions. They don't offer any first steps towards even exploring solutions. And one of the things that Alex does in his book is to provide an action plan for business leaders, board members, investors, and citizens to start implementing change immediately. That's encouraging and very beneficial. So highly recommend the book. And again, Professor, thanks so much for your time and for the great info today.
Thanks so much. Really enjoyed it. Thank you to Navin and Michael for setting this up. It's a huge pleasure to be hosted by the Society. And thank you so much to everybody for giving up an hour of the evening to attend. And take care. And hopefully in the future, right, when things open up, because my book was published by Cambridge, hopefully I'll be able to do a physical event at some point and so meet those of you who are based in the region. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.